Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kayla Parr, and I'm one of the Early Childhood Pyramid Model Implementation Facilitators for Nebraska MTSS, as well as part of the Summit Planning Committee. We are very excited to have you joining us today for week 4 of our Nebraska MTSS Virtual Summit, focusing on creating a climate of support. We recognize that you as educators are potentially experiencing some uncertainty and/or anxiety at this time, but are thrilled that you have chosen to participate in this very important learning experience. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Mary Louise Hemmeter and would like to take a moment to share some of her background. Dr. Mary Louise Hemmeter is a professor of special education at Vanderbilt University. Her research focuses on effective instruction, social emotional learning, social emotional development, and addressing challenging behavior and coaching teachers. She has directed numerous projects funded by the U.S. Department of Education and Health and Human Services. Through her work on the National Center on the Social Emotional Foundations for Early Learning and funded research projects, she was involved in the development of the pyramid model for supporting social emotional competence in young children and a model for coaching teachers to implement effective practices known as practice-based coaching. She is a co-author on the Connect for Learning Early Childhood Curriculum and the Teaching Pyramid Observation Tool. She was a co-editor on the Journal of Early Intervention and the president of the Council for Exceptional Children's Division for Early Childhood. She received the Merrill B. Carnes Service to the Division Award and the Mary McAvoy Service to the Field Award. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Mary Louise Hemmeter here sharing her message with us today entitled Collaboration to Support Students in Early Childhood and Elementary Settings. So without further ado, welcome Mary Louise.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm still getting used to the disappointment of not being able to be together with people in person, but I'm glad to be here with y'all today, and it feels like I'm kind of coming full circle because when we first started pyramid model work like 20 years ago, one of the first states we did some work with was Nebraska, so it's kind of fun to be back with you guys. I have way more content, as anyone who's ever heard me speak will know that I always have way more content than we can cover. But what I really want to focus on today, so I'm going to be talking about the pyramid model, which is that Kayla just mentioned. But what I really want to do is kind of talk about the context for the work we do. And then I want to focus on why collaboration and creating a climate of support is important at all levels of the pyramid model, which I'm going to be talking about, which is a multi-tier system of support. And I just want to talk about, I feel like I'm just going to give you a few nuggets of information about each level of the pyramid and why collaboration and kind of a focus on creating a climate of support is important. If y'all want to, I'll try to save a few minutes at the end for some questions, but also told Kayla if there was a really pressing topic that people should feel free to put them in the chat, I think is the way that they're going to do that. So I'm going to kind of jump into this and start by saying, if we were in person, I would be saying to y'all, what is our goal? But when I look at this picture, I see a group of kids that include kids without disabilities, kids with disabilities. I see children who are at risk. I see children who are typically developing. I see children who are very social and children who aren't so social. And yet what I really see in this picture is 5 children that feel like they belong. And I think that really our goal in collaborating and supporting children's social emotional development is to help them feel like they belong. And so that's the goal that I want to kind of keep in mind today. Everything we can talk about collaboration, everything we can talk about working with children around their social emotional development, everything we talk about challenging behavior can really come back to do children feel like they belong? And so we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through the day. One of the things I think about a lot of the work we do is that we're talking about big emotions and little children. And so whether we're talking about 3 and 4-year-olds in your pre-K classrooms, or whether we're talking about 6, 7, 8-year-olds in your elementary classrooms, we're talking about children who are experiencing hard emotions. And oh my gosh, they're really experiencing hard emotions, I think, during this COVID time. Scared, frustrated, angry, sad, lonely, all those kind of emotions. And yet they're 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and don't know how to communicate those emotions. I mean, we know a lot of adults who have a hard time communicating those emotions. And so I think a lot of the work that we do is focused on how do we help little children communicate big emotions. And when we don't help them communicate those big emotions, or don't teach them how to deal with those big emotions, then we see challenging behavior. Most of y'all probably know about this study, but this is a study where some researchers had kindergarten teachers rate children's social skills when they were in kindergarten. And in 2015, when they looked at them 19 years later, they found that children who were reported during kindergarten to have better social skills, things as simple as sharing, cooperating, helping each other, taking turns, those kinds of things, had all sorts of better life outcomes, both school and life outcomes, than children who were reported not to have those skills. And I think that what's really important about that is that those skills, sharing, cooperating, helping, are all things that we can teach children, but we have to be really intentional about teaching them. And we have to be intentional about teaching children to use those skills regardless of whether they're at home, at school, or in the community. So I want to talk a little bit about what we know about young children with challenging behavior and the trajectory of challenging behavior, because I think most of y'all who are on this call work with pre-K and elementary kids. And we know a lot about what happens during the early childhood years and how that relates to later life outcomes. And so we know things like if you look at an at-risk population of preschool kids who are 3 to 5 years old, we know that about 30% of those children can have problem behavior, and that they can have problem behavior that impacts their ability to engage. And when they're not engaged in the learning environment, they're less likely to be learning. We also know that really significant challenging behavior during the preschool years is very predictive of how children are doing later in life. We know that we have a better chance of helping children if we deal with behavior when they're young. I don't know how much, many of y'all probably already know these data, but there's just kind of an increasing awareness about the rate of suspension and expulsions among pre-K kids. And it's about 3 times as high for pre-K kids as it is for kids in K-12. And more recent data that have actually looked at suspensions and expulsions of pre-K children have found that it disproportionately impacts young boys of color. And so whereas young children of color make up about 18% of the preschool population, they make up almost 50% of the preschool population who get suspended or expelled from pre-K, and they make up about 80% of those who get suspended or expelled more than once. So all the disproportionate data we know about in elementary school really is true when children are even younger. And I'm not going to read you this slide. You can certainly read it. But I think the issue about suspensions and expulsions of pre-K children and kindergarten children especially, is that they're just learning how to be in school. And many of the behaviors that they get suspended for when they're in pre-K and kindergarten are behaviors that they're not going to learn if they're not in school. And so, in essence, they're getting suspended and expelled for the very behaviors that they need to be in school to learn, right? We also know that the best predictor of suspension and expulsion is a previous one. So kids who are suspended and expelled once are more likely to be suspended and expelled multiple times. And we know that that has a negative impact on children's development. It has a negative impact on families. And ultimately, it's done to help the adults. It's not done to help the child. So rarely does the use of exclusionary discipline practices with little kids who are still learning social skills, really rarely is that good for the child. So I just want to kind of place that in context. I want to talk a little bit about what families say who have young children with challenging behavior. These are two parents or parents of a young boy who has autism and had challenging behavior. And they talked a lot about how they couldn't believe what had happened to their family over the time that this child had had challenging behavior, and that the family wasn't able to go out in public without people commenting on the child's behavior, that they weren't invited to things that other families were invited to because of their child's behavior. And I mostly say this because what we also know that families say, and this really sets us up for what we're going to talk about most of the day, which is really about how do we collaborate and build systems of support. What most families of children with problem behavior say is that they didn't know where to turn for help. So if we're kicking kids out of school, suspending children from school, expelling children from school, where do parents go for help with children with challenging behavior? So they feel like they don't have a lot of help. They feel like they're often blamed for their child's challenging behavior. So we hear all these things from families that in fact aren't conducive to really supporting the family and supporting the child. We also hear, because for those of y'all, and as Kayla mentioned in the introduction, I do a lot of work around supporting teachers. And we also hear, no matter how many surveys or interviews we do of teachers of young children, when you say, what's most challenging to you? What do you feel like you need more training on? What, stresses you out? It's almost always children's behavior. It almost always has to do with children's social emotional development and challenging behaviors. And I think often teachers feel like they don't have a lot of support around kids with challenging behaviors. And I think they often feel like it's just one more thing that they have to do on top of this list of things they have to do. And so to me, when a child is having a hard time being in school, it's not just the teacher's fault. As a matter of fact, I wouldn't say it's the teacher's fault. It's not just the teacher's responsibility to help the child be successful in school, but it's the school's responsibility. So my first question when a teacher's having a really hard time with a child with behavior issues is, what support exists in your school to be able to support you around that child? So I think if we kind of think about this cumulatively, what I've talked about is that kids who have problem behaviors when they're young are more likely to be older children with challenging behaviors. They're likely, if they're suspended once, they're more likely to be suspended multiple times. If they're identified with a behavior problem early, they're more likely to be put in a behavior disorder, emotional disorder label, and then in classrooms serving those kids as they move through the elementary school system. And their teachers and their families don't feel like they have the support to help them. And so that kind of sets us up for why we have to think about how we support teachers and families at all tiers of a multi-tiered system of support. And so in the work that we do, our focus is really, we say it over and over and over again, that our focus is on adopting a posture of support. So we don't think about behavior management, we think about behavior support, as I know you guys do in Nebraska. So I feel like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but we think about how do we support children's appropriate behavior rather than how do we manage their inappropriate behavior. We think about how do we support all families to be advocates and supports for their children. And we believe strongly that there's not a one size fits all approach to supporting families. We believe that when you're working with families of young children, that's the time. That's the time. So we get a lot of families that come into pre-K classrooms who have had bad educational experiences, and it's our chance to help them see school as a place that their child can be successful and that will be supportive to them as families. As I said earlier, we believe that the work we do has to be focused on giving teachers tools and strategies and supports they need to help all children. And we believe that we have to provide supports to programs, to schools, to those places where children are spending their days. And our goal is not about, like, you don't see anything on here about preventing challenging behavior or about addressing challenging behavior. What you really see on here is a focus about promoting children's competence and confidence. And that's about promoting families' confidence and competence, and promoting teachers' confidence and competence, and supporting the inclusion of all children, not the exclusion of children. And we're not here specifically to talk about kids with disabilities today, but I think as someone who started out in the field of special education, I've been very concerned for many years about inclusion of children with disabilities. And now I'm but most concerned in some ways about children with challenging behaviors who maybe don't qualify for special ed services, but are being excluded because of their behavior. There's a few things that I want to say, and because of the length of time that we have, I can't go into a lot of detail about this, but I want to say that, we've always felt like the pyramid model was about supporting all children. And we've always believed that that meant that we had to have an approach that was culturally responsive. And I think all our work for many years has been focused on that. And I think with the recent data on suspension and expulsion, and I just presented preschool suspension and expulsion date, but the disproportionality happens, of course, throughout the pre-K through grade 12 system. And so we're really trying to apply an equity lens to our work, and we're trying to acknowledge and think about how do we address implicit bias, because we know implicit bias is in many cases impacting our use of inappropriate discipline practices. The other thing that I want to kind of put out there is that as we've talked through the years about the disproportionate use of inappropriate discipline practices, what I don't know that we've done well enough is talk about the disproportionate use of appropriate discipline practices. And so what's most likely happening in classrooms is that the children who are getting suspended and expelled might be the same children who aren't getting the access to the positive discipline practices. And so one thing I want y'all to think about when I talk about equity is not just equity related to who's getting these inappropriate discipline practices, but equity in terms of how are we ensuring that every child in a classroom has access to positive, appropriate, supportive, individually relevant behavior support practices. So think about equity, and the same goes for our work with families, the same goes for our work with teachers, are we applying our supports equitably across teachers, families, and children from different backgrounds? So I'm going to just kind of talk through the pyramid model for the time that we have left. I'm just watching my time here. And really talk about how I kind of brought this up or mentioned this at the beginning, talk about how support for teachers, families, and children are kind of integrated into each level of the pyramid. So it's not like we talk about families at the base of the pyramid, but we think about families at all levels of the pyramid. So the pyramid doesn't look any different than kind of most any multi-tiered system of support that you've seen. But I do want to say a couple of things about it. One is that we believe strongly that the success of the pyramid is built on a foundation of providing support to teachers and families. And so where you see the yellow level of the pyramid, the effective workforce, what we're really focused on there is how do we make sure that teachers and other people who directly work with children and families, how do we ensure that they have the supports they need to be successful in doing that? And then the tiers of the pyramid are what you're used to seeing, which are kind of a universal promotion tier. And for us, we talk about relationships and environments as the two components of the universal tier. And then we, of course, talk about targeted social emotional supports and intensive interventions. I'll say, and I mean, y'all, I know many of y'all know a lot of this as it relates to K-12 especially, but in our pre-K work, when we've been working in pre-K classrooms with teachers who are, the classrooms are inclusive, meaning they have children with and without disabilities and children who are at risk, primarily because of income. When we've been working in those classrooms, we have tried to identify 3 children who might need intensive interventions, and we've often had a hard time finding any children that really need individualized behavior support once we're doing the other tiers of the pyramid well. And I think much of that is because with young children who are engaging in problem behavior don't have the skills. And so it's really, we really focus heavily on instruction. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Instruction of social skills, emotional competencies, relationship skills, all of those things. And when you focus on teaching those things, you really don't have many young children whose behavior persists to the level of needing individualized behavior support planning. That doesn't mean we don't have some kids, but we really don't have very many when we're supporting teachers well around the other tiers of the pyramid. So I'm going to talk about each tier, just give you a couple of examples, a couple of tools that you can use. I'll put a website up on the last slide, but if you don't know our website, we have a website that's challengingbehavior.org. Challenging behavior is all one word, .org. And you can go there and get almost everything that you'll see me talk about today. You can go and download it. So I'm going to just kind of give you a little bit of a taste of each tier, give you a few examples of resources, and then wrap up at the end talking a little bit about research. So we really focus primarily on prevention and promotion because that's really what we think is important for kids under the age of 8. We really think that early childhood, and when I say early childhood, I kind of think about birth through 3rd grade, that really that's the time children are learning to be together with other kids. They're learning to be in group settings. They're learning to learn. They're learning to know what it means to be in school. And that if we just focus our work on promotion and prevention, we really don't have a lot of kids with more intense problem behavior. So at the base of the pyramid, we talk about relationships. And if you go back to what I talked about at the beginning about those children and the sense of belonging that we want to establish, we're always thinking about relationships between children. And we're not assuming that if you just put children in a classroom together, they'll be social beings, but we know that there are skills that are involved in interacting with peers, in being in group settings with peers, and playing with peers and working with peers. And we're very intentional about how we teach those relationship skills. One of the things I love about this photograph is I think about how if you think of something you're scared to do, like jumping off the dock into very cold water, and a friend holds your hand and says, come on, why don't you do it with me? That seems like a really natural thing for kids to do. And yet, if we think about children that we're really struggling with, those things aren't just natural for children to do. In other words, children need to be taught. If you're scared to do something, ask a friend to do it with you, or to a more competent peer to say, if you see a friend who's scared to do something, what could you do to help him or her, right? And so we're always trying to think about, don't assume that kids are going to be natural peers. Because when we do that, the children who don't come to school with those skills, who don't learn through just good, high quality experiences, those are the children who are going to get left behind. So we're really explicit about how we teach those relationship skills. When we think about families and children and adults, again, we're really intentional about making sure that children know that they have someone at school who's their cheerleader or who is their support person, right? So this is a quote I really love. Yuri Bronfenbrenner was a famous psychologist, and he said, every child needs one person who's irrationally crazy about him. And I think if you read the research on resiliency and you read about children who grew up in really chaotic environments and then they became really successful, and you ask them what made a difference for them, it's almost a person. Like they'll say, oh, I had this teacher when I was in fourth grade, or, oh, I had this basketball coach, or I had this aunt, or I had this whoever, Sunday school teacher, whatever, and they did something, right? And so what I really want to push y'all to think about is, who is that child in your classroom, or who is that child, those children in your classroom who maybe don't have a person like that in their life? Who is that child in the classroom who everybody either avoids because they have difficult behavior, or who is quiet and somewhat withdrawn and easy to have in the classroom and doesn't really connect with someone in that classroom? And so I really like to say to teachers when I'm working with them and they say, I am really struggling with this child, I always like to start by saying, what do you like about this child? What does he or she do that makes them successful? What's one thing they do that goes well some days, to really get people to tune in to those children who might be harder to connect with. So I often have, when I'm working with teachers or students, I often have them keep track over the course of a week in their classroom which children they really have sustained conversations with. So not did you do your work, those kind of questions, but what was something fun you did this weekend, and you have a conversation with them about what they did at home, or you have a conversation with them about their favorite subject at school, or something that's just about getting to know the kid. And what people say upon reflecting at the end of a week or at the end of several days of doing this will say, I spend a lot of time doing that with some kids and almost no time with other kids. And I think what we often find is that those children who we struggle with most, or who push our buttons, or who are less likely to follow directions or finish their work or whatever, that we spend a lot of time with those children trying to trying to get them to finish their work or get them to do the right thing, but we don't spend a lot of time as a promotion strategy just trying to connect with the child and being that one kind of go-to person for the child. And then the last thing that we think about around relationships is about our relationship. Well, not the last thing. We're also going to talk about colleagues, but we also think about relationships with families. And I think that I love this quote: parents need to know that we care before they care what we know. I think right now, every parent I talk to is stressed out about COVID and whether we're going to school or not going to school, and the issues that families are having with that, as y'all all know. I mean, again, I'm preaching to the choir, vary greatly in terms of how old the kids are, in terms of how much flexibility they have in their own work schedules, in terms of access to technology. Whatever is really different during COVID. But I think the bigger issue is that we need to be thinking that way about all families. And so the other thing that I always say, I used to be the director of a program at Vanderbilt, of a program for young kids. And I used to say to people, I really believe families are doing the best they can with what they have. And I think that, often I've certainly been in meetings with families where families feel like they're being blamed for their child's behavior. And anytime we start to blame, we put a barrier up to being able to work together. And so, what I like to think about is that parents are doing the best they can with what they have, and how can I meet the family there? Walter Gilliam, who's a colleague of mine and who has done much of the work on preschool suspension and expulsion, said on a webinar one day, I've never seen a case where a child was expelled from preschool or childcare when the teachers and parents knew and liked each other. I've never seen it once. And I don't think it's about liking each other, but I think it's about when we really know what a family's going through, we want to support them, versus when we assume that families just are choosing not to be engaged or are not helping their kids get to school on time or helping their kids get on, when we assume that they're just not making that a priority versus assuming that there are all sorts of things preventing them from being able to do that, then we're not as successful with families. So I like to think about, let's assume good intentions with families and let's meet them where they are, right? And it's when we really know families and we really understand their situation that we can be most successful in supporting them. I just put in some slides of some things that we've used in delivering good news to families. I do a lot of research in Australia, although obviously I'm not going there too often right now. And in early elementary classroom that I was working with in I guess it was kindergarten in Australia, they had Super Teddy was a super friend in the classroom, and the kids all got to take Super Teddy home. There were 4 of them, and they got to take pictures of Super Teddy doing things that were connected to their expectations at school, at home. And then they had all these books that they put together about the adventures of Super Teddy. So one of the things we really like about doing this is that we often talk about sharing information with families about what our expectations are at school, but we like to also talk to families about how their expectations at home might be different than our expectations at school, and help children understand why that might be. So children can bridge that. I mean, any of y'all who have young kids know that children will behave one way for you and a different way for your partner, or they'll do things at grandma's house that they would never do at home, or they'll do things they'll be quiet at church and they'll never be quiet at home, or whatever. We know children can navigate the different expectations of different environments, but we have to help them navigate that. And we can only help them navigate that if we know what the difference in expectations from home and school is, and to be okay about that, to be okay about, we can't get Sherman to sit at the lunch table. He wants to walk around eating his food. And then we find out that at home, his parents let him walk around and eat his food. Well, we don't say you need to make him sit at the table. We say, okay, that works for him at home, but at school, we have to have this expectation for this reason. We have to help children navigate that. So understanding families' expectations is not about changing them, not about changing what families expect of children at home. Sometimes it does, but that's not the goal. The goal is to say, these are the expectations your family has at home for you, and they're different than our expectations at school for this reason, and helping children bridge that. I have a whole bunch of people who work with me who have young children. And all of these things that you see on this screen are what we call pyramid win at home. And I'm constantly getting texts about this. And I just want to give you an example. So Avery, who at the time he was 4, he's probably about 7 now, wanted to look at a video on his dad's iPhone at dinner, and his mom said, no, you have to eat your broccoli first. And he didn't want to eat his broccoli. And so he just got up from the table and ran upstairs to his room. And a few minutes later, he came out and he said, I had to go to my room and take 3 deep breaths to calm down. And I love that example. And all of these examples, if I went through them, are examples of kids doing those things at home. But what's important is that these are not things that children have just, Avery didn't just go, I think I'll go to my room and take 3 deep breaths. His mom had taught him to do that. And so one of the things you're going to see as I kind of flip through these tiers very quickly is examples of how we can share that information and make it useful to families at home. So Avery, the little boy I was just talking about, his little brother Max, this was the letter that his mom got one day from his school. And she is a coach on my project. She knows about pyramid models. She's, the most positive person in the world. And yet she sent this to me because she loved that they were communicating so closely with her. So I think it doesn't take a lot, but it takes really knowing families. All right, I want to, before I kind of move on to the next tier, just say real quickly that we think that one of the ways we can be most successful with young children is to be on the same page with our colleagues about children, especially around children's behavior. And because of time, I don't want to read all this, but I just want to make the point that adults come to the arena of dealing with challenging behavior with a background of how they discipline their own children, with how they were disciplined as children, and maybe with what they've learned through training or education. But they don't always come with the same philosophy of behavior. So some come with can buy into behavior support really easy, and some people still want a more punitive approach. And so one of the things that we've been really conscious about in our work is making sure that we're not just talking to teachers, but we're talking to assistant teachers, that we're not just spending all our time with lead teachers talking about the importance of behavior support and then expecting them to go translate that independently to their co-teachers or other adults in their classrooms. We also talk to teaching teams about how you run classrooms, and all of this you can read, but we feel really strongly that how classroom teams work ought to be designed through shared decision making, that teachers ought to be spending a lot of time modeling for children what we want children to be doing. So in terms of working together, in terms of saying nice things to each other, in terms of praising each other, that we want adults to be doing that. And I'm going to just put this up and talk about this for just a minute. So this was a pre-K classroom, and this was their daily schedule. And, you have a lead teacher, an assistant teacher, a student worker, and a special ed consulting teacher. And that's who those adults are. You don't really need to know that, other than if you looked across this schedule, you would find that every adult is engaged in most every activity in the classroom, meaning that it's not just the lead teacher that teaches, and it's not just the co-teacher who does all the, or the assistant teacher or the classroom assistant, whatever y'all might call them, that does the cleanup and the get ready for meals. But in fact, you see the assistant teacher is leading large group right here. And you see that she's leading large group down here. And what we think is that when you have those shared roles in classrooms, it means that everybody can do whatever needs to be done in the absence of someone. But it also says we're a family. We're a family, and we all participate equally in this classroom, and we all communicate about what we're doing in this classroom, and we all help make decisions about what's happening in this classroom. And so that's what I wanted to just kind of put this up for, and say that in this classroom, Adrian, who's the lead teacher, would not just do this schedule. At a team meeting, they would make decisions based on where they are in the school year, what's happening on any given day during the year, during the week, about who was doing what. And this would change from week to week. So that's just an example of one way that collaborative teaming might be facilitated in a classroom. Okay, I'm going to kind of rush forward here a few things. The other part about the bottom of the pyramid is about all these things. So we think that well-designed supportive environments are consistent and predictable. They have clear expectations that are taught to children. Transitions are minimized. They're well-designed. Children are not spending a lot of time waiting with nothing to do. The activities are engaging. There's planned social opportunities, all of these kind of things. And what we find when we do training and support with teachers is that when you get these things going well, teachers have time to teach. And so when we work with teachers for a whole year, and then at the end of the year say what worked well, it's these kind of things. This is what makes a difference in classrooms. This and the kind of basic relationship building skills I talked about a minute ago. And so all of these are just visual examples of how we do some of that in the classroom. But the point I want to make about this is also that we have to support families to do these same things, right? So there are just as important as consistent and predictable routines are in the classroom. Consistent and predictable routines around getting to school in the morning or leaving school in the afternoon are important. And when you ask families who have kids with problem behavior, what's most problematic for them, it's routines. It's about how do I get out the door in the morning, or right now it's about how do I get kids set up and ready for virtual learning, or it's about how do I get my child to go to bed at night, or whatever it is. And so we make it on our website, and what I was talking about is as we're working on these things with teachers, we're giving them tools to use with to share with families for families to use at home. And so that bottom tier of the pyramid around environments and relationships, we in our research spend about 16 weeks coaching teachers, and we probably spend 12 of those 16 weeks on those bottom levels of the pyramid for a lot of teachers. And once you do that, teachers have time to teach, and they don't need a lot of support around teaching. It's finding the time, structuring the context, creating the social opportunities for teachers to teach, not just social emotional skills, but any skills, right? So those bottom tiers of the pyramid really provide teachers opportunities to teach anything. as I said earlier, we really, whoops, sorry, I put it back here. This is a quote you might have seen a lot of times, but we really believe, as I said earlier, that most behavior is about children needing new skills, right? They need to learn how to communicate well, I'll just show you. They need to learn how to engage in the expectations of the classroom. They need to learn basic friendship skills. They need to learn how to communicate their emotions. So what does a child do when they're sad or scared or angry or jealous or proud? If they don't know how to communicate those in an appropriate way, they'll communicate those in an inappropriate way. And an inappropriate way looks like challenging behavior, when in fact, as y'all know, I'm sure most of you know, most kids' problem behavior is saying to you, I'm tired, I'm scared, I'm bored, I'm hungry, I miss my mom, I want to go outside, whatever it is. And it's not that we teach children to just communicate their emotions, but we teach them what to do with it. So I remember saying to a teacher one time, she said, my kids are always getting mad in my classroom. And I'm like, well, what do you do when you're mad? What do you do when you're mad so they can see what you do when you're mad? And she said, oh, I would never let them see me mad. Well, in fact, I think it's good for kids to see adults mad and to be able to say, I'm feeling really angry right now. I'm going to go sit down by myself and look at a book, or give the child a strategy for something they can do when they're mad. When you're feeling frustrated, when I'm frustrated, I get a friend to help me finish whatever I'm doing. Or when I'm lonely, I can ask a teacher to read a book to me. Or when I'm nervous, I can ask a friend to walk to the lunchroom with me. That we expect children not only to know these emotions, but we expect them to be able to respond to those emotions in appropriate ways when that is really complex. So if you just look at the emotions on this chart, on this screen right now, happy, sad, mad, embarrassed, scared, nervous, lonely, frustrated. I mean, for those of y'all who teach second and third graders, you probably have kids who don't know how to engage in appropriate behaviors around those emotions. And yet we're asking 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-olds to be able to do it. And so I think the message around emotions and social skills, friendship skills, is don't assume that children can do it, that we really have to be intentional about teaching it. We teach children calm down strategies. I sometimes think if I walk in a classroom one more time and hear adults say to a kid, you need to calm down, I'm not sure children know what it means to calm down. I'd rather hear someone say, you're really angry right now. Here are 2 things you can do to calm down. You can go sit by yourself for a few minutes, or you can sit here with me. Or you can go get your favorite book and look at the book for 5 minutes, or you can sit with Mr. James and work a puzzle, whatever. But that we're responding to those emotions in ways that say, here's what you do when you feel this way, not you shouldn't feel this way. And a lot of times the way we respond to emotions does sound like we're saying to kids, you shouldn't feel that way. Again, with all of our every time we're working on these things in school, we have companion materials to send home for families to do. So if we're teaching about problem solving at school, then we have a solution kit and a social story and visuals that parents can use to think about being good problem solvers at home. For teaching calm down at school, we can teach calm down at home as well. And then this is just an example of a letter that we might send home to parents. So if we do all that, as I said earlier, we don't have a lot of children with challenging behavior. But we also know, as y'all do, that if you don't have something to deal with those children whose behavior persists, even when you've been doing all those things wrong, teachers aren't going to feel like they've been supported, right? And so, as with most multi-tiered systems of support around behavior, we have a assessment-based process at the top of the pyramid, which is really functional assessment, behavior support planning, what y'all know. But I want to show you. This is a set of materials we have for families. that if you were going to do parent groups with families, you could share that with families. But I'm trying to, sorry. I want to get to this real quick in our last few minutes. So this little boy, Jackson, I'm going to just show you, hopefully this will play. We'll see. I'm going to kind of flip around this and show you a few of his behaviors. So he throws things. He gently hits this little girl. And he takes toys away from kids. So anyway, in the interest of time, those are the behaviors that we see. And this is a child who's in a classroom that's doing, where the teachers are doing a lot of good things. And he's a child that it would be easy to think that his behavior was a little bit out of control, right? And yet what works for him is what works for all children. So again, I'm just going to show you the very beginning of this. Okay, we'll take your time. Do you want some more pineapple? So the whole thing kind of goes like that. And essentially what's changed here is not much about Jackson, but they've taught Jackson some roles in the play. They've created a learning center, what we would call in pre-K classrooms, a dramatic play center that now has roles and has specific things that the cashier can do versus the customer can do. And they've taught him those things. And what you can see is not only is he more successful, but the other children know how to support him in that. So he would have had a behavior support plan in place at this point, but it doesn't look like a behavior support plan. It just looks like the environment has been redesigned to help support him and to help his peers support him, right? So now, instead of the children kind of being afraid to play with him, they're actually inviting him to play. So I want to just say a couple of things here to finish up, which is, so that's the pyramid. That's what we train teachers to do, support teachers to do. But we also in our work do a lot of coaching with teachers. So we don't expect teachers to go to a 3-day training on the pyramid and then just go do it, because all of us know it's never as easy as that. I always equate that to like going to a tennis lesson, if any of y'all play tennis, and then being able to play tennis. It doesn't work that way, right? You learn about tennis and then you practice with people giving you feedback, and you gradually get better. And that's how we think coaching is. And so we use a coaching model, but I just want to show you an example of a piece of data here, which is, so this line right here is teachers who got coaching on the pyramid model. And this is teachers who didn't. And this is measuring their implementation of the pyramid model. So you can see that when teachers got support, they were able to implement the practices with a lot more fidelity. And this blue line is the children in their class. So when teachers get support, and when we do coaching, it's a collaborative coaching partnership. It's not an evaluative thing. It's not telling teachers what to do. It's working with teachers to decide what kind of support they need. But when we do that, the children in their classrooms, so these are children who have the most challenging behavior, this is improvements in their social skills that we see as a result of them implementing the pyramid model with higher levels of fidelity. The other thing, and I really don't have time to go into this, but the other thing we know is that there are other supports that need to be in place. And so for lots of y'all who are in school-wide, who are in schools that do school-wide PBIS, this is essentially what we're talking about. But it's about what are the other systems in the program? We call program-wide implementation when we're doing it in early childhood settings, but what are the other systems of support that need to be in place so that teachers can implement those practices well? And one thing, just as an example, that needs to be in place is that if you're implementing these practices really well, and then you have a child like Jackson or a child like Sky, these are all children that I've worked with, who have problem behavior, who's there to help you? Who's there to support you to do that? And if you're in a K-12 school, you generally have a behavior support person. Sometimes those people know about children under age 6, and sometimes they don't. And that's something that I think we need to be really intentional about, is identifying people who know how to support teachers who work with 3 and 4 and 5-year-old children in our elementary schools, because a classroom for 3 and 4-year-olds looks really different than a classroom for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-olds. When we do this kind of program-wide model, we get good outcomes for teachers, we get good outcomes for children, and we generally get more satisfied teachers because everybody's on the same page. All right, you have to forgive me for 1 second because I'm going to skip through a bunch of slides because I just want to kind of wrap up. But I want to wrap up by just saying that, I think that we have effective practices to support children's social emotional development and to prevent their challenging behavior and to address their challenging behavior when it happens. We have practices. We have data-based practices to do that. I think the challenge is how we ensure that those practices get to all children. And I think that where I started this conversation talking about equity, I feel much the same way right now, which is that the children the children who need these practices most are sometimes the children who are least likely to get them. And I want to end by saying that that there are some children who are going to thrive in school no matter what we do. And those are fun children to have in our classroom, and they challenge us, and they're engaging to be around, and every day we feel like we're successful because of those children. And then there are those children who challenge us and whose families challenge us, and there are colleagues who challenge us. And I think I want to just challenge us to think about, I'm saying challenging too many times, but when there are children or adults, or whether they're teachers or families or colleagues that challenge us, that what we really need to do is ask questions and be curious. So when someone is being resistant, whether it's a child or an adult, that we ask, why might they be resistant? What might be an alternative hypothesis for their behavior? And so much like we think about young children who have challenging behavior, we're all kind of tuned into what's the function of the behavior, what's the message of the behavior, what's the child trying to communicate with the behavior. I think we have to do the same thing with adults, because it's not that adults don't have the language, but it's that systems have been built that don't always support adults, and that we need to be asking, what are those messages of the adults' behavior in our life, whether they're families of children we're working with, or whether they're the colleagues we're working with, and what supports might help them communicate their needs or be more successful in much the same way we think about children. So I'm going to end, I know we're right at the end of time, by saying that everything I've talked about today is on this website, and almost everything you would want to use is free to download, and we hope you'll visit the website.
Thank you so much for being here with us today and willing to share your knowledge. Your message of adopting a posture of support for all children, families, teachers, and programs is really powerful. And that our ultimate goal is to create a climate where children feel they belong. We now know that we will be most successful through sustained partnerships with both teachers, families, and other professionals. And then the practical strategies and resources you shared with us today will help us meet this ultimate goal. So again, we thank you. I would like to take a couple minutes and give the participants a chance to ask any questions. Go ahead. If you have a question, feel free to type that in the chat for either Mary Louise or myself, and then we'll look to close. So Mary Louise, you're getting some positive feedback here.
Great. I might not be looking at the right thing, but.
Okay. Just someone shared that it was a great session. Supporting adults is so important. Another had shared, very big fan of your work and happy to have heard you in person. Any further thoughts or questions before we close?
Thank you, guys. I know this isn't the funnest way to do it, but thank you for being here. So,
yes, eventually we will get to the in-person soon again. But until then, I just want to thank the participants for taking the time to be with us today. We look forward to having you participate over the next 2 weeks with us. We will be back on Thursday at 4:30 with Adam Welcome discussing school climate and supporting all staff. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
thank you.